That October morning smelled of stale rain and reheated coffee. The clock read 2:17 when he, a former detective with a damaged knee and too many sleepless nights behind him, reviewed a worn notebook where he still jotted down neighborhood habits as if he were still patrolling in his mind. He lived alone in a modest house, tidy with almost military precision, clean tools, an old radio playing softly, and a yellowish lamp casting sharp shadows on his desk. Since his forced retirement, he had learned to fill the silence with routines, night classes in criminology, short walks at dawn, and regular calls to his teenage daughter, always on odd-numbered days. This was one of those nights where his body seemed to be on pause, but his instincts remained vigilant until the phone vibrated with that sound that tears at your chest before your mind can react. His daughter's name appeared on the screen next to an outdated photo. A shy smile, braces, a t-shirt stained with paint. When she answered, her voice was broken, a mixture of rapid breaths and pressed words. She was at the police station, injured, falsely accused by her stepfather. She asked him to come. He didn't need anything more. The former detective got up without thinking, grabbed his heavy jacket that still smelled of rainy nights, his notebook and an old flashlight, a relic of another time, and left. Outside, the street was empty, gleaming under the lampposts like a frozen scene. As he started the engine, the rough sound of the starter reminded him of the early mornings on duty, those when the truth slept behind a door, closed in fear. That night, without knowing it, he was going to reopen one of those doors, but this time not out of duty, but out of blood. The police station smelled of damp paper, burnt coffee, and sleeplessness. The cold lights in the hallway cast a grey hue over everything, even the eyes of those waiting. Upon arriving, the first thing he saw was his daughter sitting in a blue plastic chair, her hair disheveled and a dried trail of blood beneath her nose. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, as if counting the tiles to avoid breaking. Beside her, her stepfather, impeccably dressed in a perfectly wrinkled white shirt, spoke in a measured voice, feigning calm, showing a small cut above his eyebrow as proof of his assault. It was the classic scene he knew by heart, the aggressor occupying the space, narrating before being questioned, trying to mold the truth to his advantage. The former detective stood still for a few seconds, taking in the details. The man's shoes stained with fresh dust, the slight tremor in his daughter's right hand, the young officer with the broken pen between his fingers. Everything in that room held the contained tension of a poorly told story. He asked to speak with the officer on duty with the composure of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. Meanwhile, he noticed his daughter's phone on the table, the recording app still running, the minutes ticking away. It was a live lead. Silently, a single glance was enough for him to understand that the recording contained the other version, the true one. In that instant, experience and love merged into a single current. He wasn't going to allow the manipulation to be repeated, nor would he allow the truth to be trapped in bureaucracy. The young officer, his face still free of cynicism, led them into a small room with walls covered in posters about victims' rights. There, the former detective again observed with clockwork precision the stepfather's movements, the way he touched his own cut whenever he mentioned self-defense, the way he looked away whenever the word minor came up. He had seen that body language hundreds of times. It wasn't the body language of a frightened man, but of someone calculating. When the officer asked if he wanted to make a statement, the former detective answered without hesitation, "I just want you to search everything and check the building security cameras. The trustee has them." The young man nodded, still not fully grasping the weight of what he had just heard. Meanwhile, the trustee, a grey-haired man in a wool coat with a sleepy face, arrived with a flash drive dangling from a metal key ring. He said he had reviewed the security camera footage from the hallway and the elevator. In the images, the stepfather appeared banging on the apartment door, yelling something before the teenager came out, trying to defend herself. There was no provocation or prior attack, only fear. The silence in the room grew heavy. The former detective leaned slightly toward the officer and added in a firm voice, "There's also an audio recording from the 911 call. She activated it without him noticing." There was no anger in his tone, only the calm of someone who knows that facts, when well documented, speak louder than any fake tears. The pieces began to fall into place with the precision of a reopened case. The audio revealed the girl's ragged breathing, the sharp sound of a blow, and the stepfather's voice uttering phrases that, out of context, sounded like desperation, but together they were pure control. The former detective requested that everything be secured under chain of custody: audio, video, medical report, and 911 record. Inside, a mixture of pride and rage surged like an electric current. Pride in his daughter's composure, rage that she had to learn to survive that way. He watched the young officer note down every detail and silently recalled his own training. Good officers aren't born, they awaken on nights like that. When the on-call doctor handed over the preliminary report, the air in the room grew even heavier. Old fractures, bruises in various stages of healing, signs of repeated violence. The teenager lowered her gaze, and the former detective clenched his fists in his jacket pockets. He said nothing. There was no need. In his mind, everything was arranged like a timeline. Previous assaults, emotional manipulation, domestic silence. The stepfather, until then trusting, began to lose his color when the officer informed him that he would be detained for further questioning. For the first time, his victim act crumbled, and in the former detective's eyes, something was reflected that wasn't vengeance, but an old promise that police officers make without speaking. No abuser remains hidden forever. The interrogation dragged on for hours, though the clock barely moved. The teenager recounted with precision how it had all begun, the insults that escalated into shoves, the shoves into blows, and the ingrained fear that takes hold when a home becomes a minefield. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. The former detective watched her from the other side of the glass, recalling every case where a victim took too long to be believed. The stepfather tried to interrupt several times, but the young officer, a quick learner, authoritatively silenced him. It was a small but symbolic change. The scales were beginning to tip in the right direction. Meanwhile, the 911 records confirmed the timeline. The call had lasted exactly 3 minutes, with the background sounds clearly captured. There was no doubt. The on-duty prosecutor authorized the preventive detention and ordered a background check. What appeared in the system was like a forgotten piece that fell into place. A previous complaint filed away and another in a different city, closed for lack of evidence. The former detective knew it. The pattern was complete. In the hallway, the air grew colder, and the teenager, wrapped in a grey blanket, finally allowed herself to cry without fear of judgment. Outside, a police siren broke the silence, and for the first time in a long time, that sound didn't seem threatening, but fair. As the sun began to peek through the police station windows, the former detective felt his body ache as if he'd run for miles, but his mind remained sharp. He watched the prosecutor review the file line by line with the tense gaze of someone who knows a technicality could free a guilty person. The girl's mother arrived at dawn, distraught, her face pale and her hands trembling. She said nothing at first. She approached her daughter, awkwardly stroking her hair, like someone trying to mend years of broken trust. The former detective kept to himself, knowing it wasn't his time. That family needed to start rebuilding themselves from the truth, not from guilt. Mid-morning, the arrest warrant without bail was issued. The stepfather lowered his head when he heard the charges: assault, filing a false police report, and witness intimidation. He didn't protest. He just pressed his lips together, and the former detective knew that this silence wasn't resignation, but calculation. Even so, the system, for once, worked. The young officer, now with a wrinkled shirt and burning eyes, approached the former detective and shook his hand. "Thank you for teaching us how to look beyond the report," he said. It was a brief gesture, but in that handshake 2 generations of justice crossed paths, one that had learned through hard knocks and another that was learning to listen. The hospital received the teenager with the same smell of disinfectant and fear as any place where pain becomes routine. The medical examiner documented every mark, every fracture, every scar that spoke louder than words. The former detective stayed close, but without intruding, allowing his daughter space to process the weight of the examination. When the medical report was sent to the Department of Justice and CPS, he knew the case was no longer just a family matter. It had become an institutional one. The mother, still in shock, signed the authorization for divorce and protective measures. The former detective's face showed weariness, but also a different kind of calm. The kind that comes when the truth, at last, has written backing. If you've made it this far, tell me where you're reading this story from. Sometimes you don't realize how much it changes to hear a truth that could be anyone's. Knowing where in the world you're reading from is also a way of sharing it, because behind every screen there may be someone who hasn't yet dared to speak out. Within days, the case took shape within the judicial system. The audio recording, the building's security camera footage, the background information, and the medical report wove a narrative impossible to dismantle. The stepfather was transferred to a detention center, while the daughter began therapy with a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. The former detective visited the hospital every morning, bringing coffee and silence, without initiating conversations. He knew that the time of survivors isn't measured by clocks, but by the distance they manage to put between one memory and the next. Outside, the media was beginning to learn about the case, but he avoided cameras and headlines. He didn't want media justice. He wanted real justice. As the weeks passed, the investigation progressed like a well-oiled machine. Junior officers began using the case as an example in internal workshops on domestic violence. They informally dubbed it the Harland Protocol, after the former detective, who had insisted that what mattered wasn't the heroes, but the procedures: record the audio, preserve the evidence, listen without prejudice. Every detail that had saved his daughter could save others. The police, accustomed to closing cases without sufficient evidence, began to document better, request security footage, and record emergency calls with greater sensitivity. It was as if the experience of that early morning had lit a flashlight amidst the bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the daughter, now out of the hospital, was adjusting to living with her father. The room that had been a storage room was transformed into a warm space filled with books, small plants, and a guitar he had kept for years. There were slow, unhurried conversations, with silences that no longer weighed so heavily. The teenager resumed her studies and, at her therapist's suggestion, began to write about her experience. What started as a healing exercise became a school project, a text titled "Listening Saves Lives." When she read it aloud to the class, some classmates cried, others applauded. For the first time, she felt that the voice they had once tried to silence now served to ignite others. The former detective watched her from afar, both proud and fearful. He had learned that survivors don't seek revenge, but consistency, that society fulfill its promise to protect them. The mother, for her part, gradually integrated herself into the process. She attended family therapy and confronted the pain of having ignored obvious warning signs. There were tears, but also words that had been forbidden in their home for years. "I'm sorry. I believe you. It wasn't your fault." The three of them began to rebuild. A language of trust that needed no scripts or imposed silences. The hardest part was accepting that, even after the divorce and the trial, the scars don't disappear. They simply learn to coexist with the light. The stepfather's trial was swift, thanks to the overwhelming evidence. He tried to change his story several times, but each lie was met with a recorded or documented counterpoint. The former detective sat in the back row of the courtroom, out of uniform, without badge, his gaze fixed on someone who no longer investigates to punish, but to heal wounds. When the judge handed down the sentence, guilty of assault and filing a false report with no possibility of immediate appeal, there was absolute silence. The man was led away in handcuffs, and the teenager's face showed no joy, only relief. She knew that justice couldn't bring back lost time, but it did open the possibility of a future without fear. In the following months, the story transcended the courtroom walls. A local journalist with sensitivity and respect published a report on the case, highlighting how a simple voice recording had changed the course of an investigation. She called it "The Call That Ignited the Truth." The article had an unexpected impact. Police stations in other districts began replicating the method, reviewing security camera footage in domestic cases, comparing medical records with patterns of prior abuse, and, above all, believing the victim's initial accounts. The former detective received messages from former colleagues, some incredulous, others grateful. He always responded the same way: "It's not my protocol. It belongs to everyone who chose to listen." The daughter, now more composed, agreed to give a talk at her school about early signs of abuse. She arrived nervous, her palms sweaty, with a sheet of paper folded several times in her pocket. But as she began to speak, her voice took on a new firmness. She told her story without self-pity, with the naturalness of someone who understands that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply breathes. The teachers listened, holding back tears. When she finished, one of the students raised his hand and said, "I've heard something similar at home, too." That impromptu confession was enough for the school to activate its reporting protocol. She understood that her testimony not only healed one wound, but also prevented others. The former detective, meanwhile, had returned to his routine, but nothing was the same. His notebooks, once filled with descriptions of cars and suspicious movements, were now overflowing with notes on empathy, support procedures, and psychological helplines. He had realized that his experience, accumulated over decades of work, could have a different purpose: to teach prevention rather than punishment. He began collaborating with the local police academy, giving talks to new cadets on how to detect lies, but also on how to recognize fear. He said that fear has texture, sound, and smell, that a good officer doesn't look for culprits, but for consistency. His words spread, and little by little, the Harlan Protocol ceased to be an anecdote and became internal policy. The mother, for her part, joined a support group for parents who hadn't seen the signs. There, surrounded by others carrying similar burdens of guilt, she found a place to transform shame into action. She began organizing workshops in schools and community centers, speaking about psychological control, emotional blackmail, and the early signs of abuse. She didn't claim to be an expert, just someone who had learned in time. At the end of one of these talks, an older man approached her and said, "Thank you. Today I understood what my daughter couldn't tell me." That phrase stayed with her on the way home, a confirmation that sometimes acknowledging mistakes also saves lives. As the months passed, the teenager transformed her experience into a calling. She applied to a volunteer program at the district attorney's office, where she helped review old case files and digitize complaint records. It wasn't a glamorous job, but for her, each file represented a story that deserved to be told accurately. Her mentor, a young prosecutor who had closely followed the case, taught her how good documentation can uphold the truth even when voices tremble. That routine among papers, cold coffee, and yellowed files became her way of healing, rescuing the voices that, like hers, were once minimized or ignored. The former detective waited for her every afternoon in the car, listening to the news at a low volume and checking his watch with a patience he'd never possessed during his career. One afternoon, as she packed her notes in her backpack, he mentioned that they were preparing a school bill to strengthen psychological support for victims of abuse. "Perhaps you could participate," he said. She looked at him, surprised, and replied, "I don't want to tell my story again, but I do want it to make a difference." He nodded. He had learned not to pressure her, to let the initiative come from her. That night when they arrived home, her mother was waiting for them with the table set and 3 steaming cups of coffee. It was their first peaceful dinner in years. The bill moved forward with unusual speed. Inspired by real cases, it aimed to ensure that public schools had staff trained to detect early signs of domestic violence and offer immediate psychological support. The teenager, though reluctant to be in the spotlight, agreed to speak at a public hearing. She carried a blue folder and a short, handwritten speech. When she took the stand, her voice trembled only at first. Then, with the conviction born of processed pain, she said, "I wouldn't be here if there hadn't been a voice recorder on my cell phone. Sometimes the difference between surviving and disappearing is just a click." The audience erupted in applause. The legislators passed the bill unanimously. That afternoon, as they left, the former detective embraced her without saying a word, and in that shared silence, they understood that justice can also have a human face. The press dubbed the initiative Harlan's Law, though she insisted the name didn't matter. What was essential was that every school had the tools to intervene in time. News reports showed images of the family reunited, and for a few days the entire city seemed to revolve around this story of redemption. At home, however, they kept things simple. Shared breakfasts, the dog sleeping by the door, and short conversations about how to move forward without letting the past become their identity. In the young woman's room, above the desk, was a piece of paper taped to the wall that read, "The truth isn't shouted, it's shown." It was a phrase of hers, written in blue ink, that would eventually become the motto of a generation. As the family settled back into their routine, the young officer who had been involved that night also began his own transformation. He requested a transfer to the Domestic Crimes Unit, convinced he could make a difference. He attended courses, networked with psychologists, and worked on drafting an operational manual based on the Harlan experience. In internal interviews, he repeated a phrase he had learned that night. A good police officer isn't the one who makes the most arrests, but the one who listens best. His superiors promoted him, and he soon became a role model for new officers. The former detective watched him with a mixture of pride and hope. Seeing another follow in his footsteps was like ensuring that his daughter's story would not be forgotten. In the neighborhood, life went on as usual. The neighbors, who had previously avoided talking about it, now spoke of it respectfully. Some parents approached the former detective for advice on how to react to suspicious signs. He listened patiently, reminding them that you didn't need to be a police officer to protect, just have the courage to believe. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch his daughter study in the warm light from the dining room. There was something profoundly healing in this normalcy, in this return to the everyday noise without fear. Finally, the silence was no longer a threat, but a well-deserved respite. A year had passed since that early morning. The city had changed, and so had they. The teenager, now 18, was invited to speak at a conference on child protection policies. Her presentation was titled, "The Simplest Test Can Save a Life." In the auditorium, filled with students, prosecutors, and social workers, she recounted how an instinctive decision, pressing record while calling for help, became the cornerstone of a legislative change. The audience listened in silence, and among them, the young officer and the prosecutor on the case exchanged a knowing glance. Both knew they were witnessing more than just a lecture. It was confirmation that the system, for once, had learned from its mistakes. The former detective, sitting at the back of the room, couldn't help but recall the first time he heard her cry on the other end of the phone. Now that voice was firm, confident, and spoke not only for her, but for hundreds who were still silent. When the speech ended, the ovation was long, warm, and understated. The mother, tears welling in her eyes, took a picture from her seat, knowing that this image, her daughter, standing before the world, was proof that darkness too can take root. In the hallway, as they gathered up the papers, the young woman said softly, "Dad, I think it all finally makes sense." He didn't reply. He just handed her a tissue, because sometimes pride too brings tears. Over time, the Harland family's story became study material for law academies and university courses. What had begun as a tragedy transformed into a model of procedure and institutional empathy. In lectures, the former detective explained that the credit wasn't his alone, but rather the result of the collaborative work between victims, authorities, and the community. He always repeated one idea: technology doesn't replace human intuition, but it can amplify it when used purposefully. That phrase was quoted in articles, manuals, and training sessions. Unintentionally, his testimony had fostered a culture of more humane care within law enforcement, one that understood that behind every complaint lies a story that deserves time, attention, and care. If this part moves you as much as it did me, please share this story. Perhaps someone who sees it today needs a reminder that believing a victim in time can change their fate. Sometimes it's not about grand gestures, but small acts: recording an audio message, making a call, asking for help, listening without judgment. Every action counts more than we imagine. The mother, meanwhile, remained active in her support group. She had gone from participant to mentor, guiding new families facing similar situations. At one meeting, a woman confessed that, thanks to her public testimony, she had found the courage to report her abusive partner. This deeply moved her. She understood that second chances aren't just about healing, but about multiplying what has been learned. At home that night, when she shared the story at dinner, her daughter smiled and said, "Now you save lives too, Mum." and for the first time the word family resonated in its entirety. Harlan's law was finally enacted on the second anniversary of the case. Schools began receiving funding to implement early intervention programs, and the former detective was invited to the symbolic signing ceremony. He wore a dark suit he had worn on his last day of service, but this time without badges or rank insignia, just a blue ribbon on his lapel. When the governor called his name, he simply bowed his head. He didn't need recognition. It was enough for him to know that the pain he had endured had not been in vain. His daughter, at his side, held a bouquet of flowers given to her by a student who had survived abuse. It was a brief, simple moment, but with the precise weight of justice served. That night, upon returning home, the family ate dinner in silence. At the table, the dogs slept at their feet, and the wall clock read 10:07, the same time when, years before, they used to turn off the lights to pretend everything was all right. But there was no longer any need to pretend. The former detective stood up, poured coffee for everyone, and toasted with a weary smile to second chances that come at the right time. The mother nodded, and the young woman, her eyes twinkling, added, "And to truths that are etched in your memory when no one wants to hear them." Outside, the wind rustled the dry autumn leaves, as if the world at last had decided to leave behind an old scene. Over the years, the story became a national touchstone. Every time a new victim came forward, thanks to a recording or the swift intervention of a teacher, news programs recalled the Harlan case. The former detective, now grey-haired and fully retired, avoided interviews. He preferred to see how others carried on his legacy: young police officers, empathetic prosecutors, attentive teachers. On his morning walks, some people recognized him and greeted him respectfully. He responded with a slight nod, aware that the true reward was seeing society move, however slowly, toward a more humane sense of justice. He didn't need monuments. The evidence of change lay in his daughter's peace of mind. While at university, she was studying law and volunteering with an organization dedicated to the defense of minors. In her lectures, she said that her father had taught her that justice begins with the details, not the headlines. When a journalist asked her if she was still afraid, she replied, "Fear doesn't disappear. It just changes location. Now it lives behind me, not in front of me." Her response spread across social media and went viral, but for her, it wasn't an inspirational quote, it was her everyday truth. That night, when she arrived home, she found her parents watching an old movie on the sofa, chuckling softly. She sat down between them, and in that simple gesture she understood that making amends doesn't always sound like victory. Sometimes it just sounds like home. One spring afternoon, the young officer, now a lieutenant, visited the former detective at his home. He carried a folder containing the new procedures manual, updated and officially approved as the Harlan Protocol. He asked him to sign it, not as the author, but as a witness. "You lit the first spark," he said. The former detective smiled, took the pen, and wrote a single sentence on the cover: "Truth has no owner." Then, as the lieutenant drove away, he watched the sun's reflection on the hood of the patrol car and felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. It was like closing a loose end, but this time not in the files, but in his soul. In the following days, routine returned to its serene rhythm. The mother continued with her workshops, the daughter with her studies, and the former detective with his garden, where each plant bore the name of a person who had survived thanks to the new protocol. There was one called Hope, another Broken Silence, and one more, Small, which he had christened Recording. He said it was the strongest of all because it had been born in darkness. One rainy afternoon, while pruning the branches, He looked up at the grey sky and thought that sometimes justice isn't measured in sentences or headlines, but in the simple fact of being able to sleep without ghosts. Time passed, and although the headlines faded, the consequences of that night continued to silently multiply. Statistics showed a decrease in dismissed cases and an increase in complaints supported by evidence. But what moved the former detective most were the letters that arrived from different parts of the country, teachers, mothers, young people, even rookie cops who wrote to thank him. In one of them, a young woman said, "If it weren't for what I learned from your story, I might never have recorded that call." He kept all the letters in a metal box next to his old badge, as if both objects were pieces of the same story, that of a man who learned that service doesn't end with retirement, but with the final act of faith in the truth. That night, the three of them ate dinner together, as they did every anniversary. On the table, a lit candle replaced the silence. The daughter, now an adult, made a toast. To the recordings that save lives, to the mothers who learn to see, and to the fathers who never stop believing. The mother smiled, and the former detective, with a serene voice and a peaceful heart, added, "And to the stories that begin where fear ends." Outside, the rain was falling again, but this time it didn't herald danger, but rather cleansing. Because in the end, that painful October had left a legacy of hope, proof etched in the souls of all who chose to listen.